Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
Well, I'm Bob Salvatore, R.A. Salvatore, and last month marked a big milestone for me because 25 years ago, last month, July of 1987, I got my first professional writing contract. I had been tasked with writing the second book in TSR's Forgotten Realms, now Wizards of the Coast, but then it was TSR. And so I started writing, and during that I created a character by the name of Drizzt, a dark elf who has caught on, and here I am a quarter century later, still writing about the guy. I've done many other books besides, including a couple of Star Wars books, and my World of Demon Wars, which I love dearly. 11 books in that world and counting. So it's been a heck of a ride. I think I've got about 53 books published now, and many more to come, I hope.
Well, what started you down the path of fantasy writing?
It was a funny thing because, I got to college and I wasn't much of a writer or a reader. When I was younger, I used to read and write all the time, but school kind of beat the interest out of me. And by the time I got to college, I was a math major.
Oh,
well,
wow.
I was actually undeclared, but everything was math. I was going for math or computer science. And then we had for Christmas, my freshman year in college, this was 1977, my sister gave me a copy of Tolkien's work. 2 months later, we had this incredible snowstorm up here in New England, the blizzard of '78. So here I was, just turned 19 years old, and trapped in my mom's house for a week because there were no roads. You could not leave the house. And, I thought, oh, joy, what am I going to do? And I actually picked up those books and read them, and I went away from that house on this magical journey to Middle-earth with a hobbit named Bilbo. It was incredible. I read those books several times that week, and my love of reading and writing came back. So I went back to school, changed my major so that all of my electives would be literature courses or creative writing courses. And then, but I had this really warm place in my heart for fantasy because of that Tolkien experience and just the escapism. I loved it so much. So I read every fantasy book I could find, and there weren't that many at that time that you could find. There was no internet in 1977, 78. But I read Terry Brooks and Stephen Donaldson and Anne McCaffrey and Michael Moorcock and Fritz Leiber. I was pretty much out at that point. And so I didn't have anything else to read. I wrote one. I wrote my own book in 1983, 84, around there. And when I finished writing it, this book called Echoes of the Fourth Magic, I wasn't planning on being published. I just sent it out, got some horrible rejection letters, and that just made me mad, so I went back to work and rewrote it. And that book actually got me the audition in 1987 to write The Crystal Shard.
Wow. Now, you're most famous for your character, how do you pronounce his full name?
It depends what day you ask me. I never really clarify that. Sometimes I say Drizzt, other times I say Drizzt, and the reason is because I think that's like the coolest marketing twist ever. I picture two kids in a high school hallway. It's Drizzt, it's Drizzt, it's Drizzt, it's Drizzt. Third kid comes over and says, "What the hell are you talking about?" And they go, "You never read these?" And I win. So we'll call him Drizzt for this one.
Very clever, yeah. Well, now that character takes place in the campaign setting of Forgotten Realms from the Dungeons & Dragons games. Were you familiar with Forgotten Realms before you wrote that character? Did you used to play Forgotten Realms before you wrote that character?
No, I was familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, very much so, because this was, like I said, 1987, and I had started playing D&D in 1980, 81, around there, when the first edition Player's Handbook came out, and first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, the first hardcover books, that's when I started playing. But what happened was I had sent my book in, the manuscript for Echoes of the Fourth Magic, and the editor liked it but couldn't publish it because she said they only had room on their schedule for Forgotten Realms books, and could I make that book a Forgotten Realms book? And so I said, well, what are the Forgotten Realms? Because they weren't out yet. Mm-hmm. So the only people who knew about the realms were the people who worked at TSR. Well, we couldn't set that book in the realms, so they gave me a crash course, and I auditioned and won the audition to do the second book, The Crystal Shard.
Cool. Was it a challenge, and has it been a challenge, writing stories taking place in Forgotten Realms in this shared world? Is it tough to keep track of where everything's at and what's going on?
Oh, it's impossible to keep track, so I don't even try. I keep track of that which is around what I'm doing, and I spend a lot of my time hiding in different corners of the world. But, as much of a challenge as it's been, it's more of a pleasure, because when Shared World is working right, you get to stand on the shoulders of giants like Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and Ed Greenwood, and the work that's come before. So, for me, the inspiration and the side stories that have cropped up because it is a shared world have helped me make the books thicker and richer and fuller than just coming up with the entire setting, plot, and everything else by myself in a lot of ways, when it works right. When it works wrong, then we have contradictions that nobody was aware of till after all the products are out. Mm-hmm. We try to keep that at a minimum, and that really depends on how well the people at Wizards of the Coast can communicate with all of the different authors, with all of the different game designers, the freelancers, the in-house people. It's that's a tough gig. Working as a coordinator for something like the Forgotten Realms would be one of the toughest jobs I could imagine.
Mm-hmm. I bet so. Well, how many do you know how many books are being made every year for Forgotten Realms in general?
Oh, the numbers gone all over the place. At one point, they were doing more than one a month, like 2-3 books a month, I think, at one point, or some crazy amount. But then other times it's slowed down where they're only doing 6 or 8 a year. But it's not just the books, the game products. I mean, you have modules and game accessories and source books and all the rest of it. And now you've got online material as well with Dungeons and Dragons Online and the new Neverwinter game coming out and the previous 2 Neverwinter games and Demon's Stone from Atari that came out a few years ago. So there's a lot of different moving parts, and it's a big job for everybody to try to keep track.
Mm-hmm. Now, your main character you're most popular for, Drizzt, he's a dark elf, which is very counterintuitive, what you would expect for a heroic character race to be in D&D or Forgotten Realms. Why did you choose a dark elf?
I didn't. He chose me. It was off the top of my head. I was under duress on the phone with the editor while I was working as a financial analyst at my day job, and she needed a sidekick for Wolfgar. And off the top of my head, I don't know why, because I'd never played one in the game. We don't even have them in my game, other than as really cool monsters. But I said a black elf. They were called black elves back in the 80s. And, I had to talk her into letting me do it. She said, go ahead, and it was because it was just a sidekick character. And then once I started writing the book, he just kind of took over. Believe me, no one was more surprised than I was to find a dark elf in my books.
Well,
I'm glad that happened, though.
For people who may not be familiar with this character, can you tell us a little bit about the character?
Sure. I think he's the classic romantic hero, and I think one of the reasons he resonates so well, particularly with younger readers, teenagers, is because everybody feels like they're misunderstood, and everybody feels like the outcast at some point in their life. And so here he is, born in this dark elf city, which, by the way, was based on Mario Puzo's work, The Godfather. When I wrote Menzo Berenzan, I based it on the basic societal structures I used as a model, The Godfather, by Mario Puzo. So he's in this world that's really tough and that he just can't stomach. And his internal moral code is just screaming at him that this is wrong. And so, he does some pretty heroic things to be able to escape that society and strike out on his own, even though he thinks it's going to be the end of him. He thinks he won't survive for long without that city around him, and he knows he'll never be really accepted in other places, or believes that anyway. And it's just his journey that we've gone through for these 25 years where he's asking himself all the big questions and trying to do what's right, sometimes against tremendous odds.
Now, sometimes people talk about that character and they say that you're making messages against racial prejudice with the character.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to do things like that. I mean, you're trying to make your books relevant. Mm-hmm. And to me, like, the stupidest thing in the world is racism. I mean, I'm a racist because I'm a human and I have this affinity toward people. The idea that there's a difference between an Italian, a Frenchman, a person from Africa, a person from Alaska, that there's I don't know. It just rings as stupid to me. But the funny thing is, I mean, that's one of the paradoxes, right, of writing in fantasy, because in fantasy there is racism, because orcs are evil, or most orcs are anyway. So that's a difficult line to walk sometimes in the fantasy genre. But I wanted to explore it, and I wanted to ask questions. And, we've seen parts of, times where the hero himself, when Drizzt himself, realized that he was being a racist and had to kind of slap himself upside the head and say, knock it off. I mean, at one point, he had made a vow where he would never kill another drow elf. Mm-hmm. But in the heat of battle, he's killing dwarves and elves and humans and all the rest. So what's so special about a drow elf? And, it was racism.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's a fun thing to explore in this safer setting of fantasy because it's a difficult subject. It's an important subject. So, I'm not gonna shy from it. When themes like that crop up in the books, I'm never going to shy from them, because if I did, then what's the point of it all? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm writing these books to ask myself the big questions of the world, and the only way I'm going to find the answers is if I do that honestly.
Yeah, I mean, fantasy, especially role-playing game fantasy, I think unintentionally has been sort of racist till maybe the last 10 or 15 years or so, because you never could play. There's always the player races, and then there's the monster races, like the orcs, the dark elves, and only recently in role-playing games have you been able to play the other characters. And I don't even know, could you even play a dark elf back then in the game when you first created the character?
I think the first time they mentioned it was when the Fiend Folio came out. They said, here's some ways, and I'm not sure if that predated or postdated the Crystal Shot. It was right around that time. But yeah, we never had any in our group.
Now, the main book we're talking about, it's the third book in the Neverwinter saga. So, what is Neverwinter, and what's the Neverwinter saga about?
Neverwinter is a city and region on the Sword Coast of the Forgotten Realms. Mm-hmm. And it's been featured in 2 computer games with a third one coming. The saga is really... I wanted to tell in the saga would have been the same story whether or not Neverwinter was involved. Because it's really the story of, I have this dark elf character, and for most of his life, he was surrounded by people who are a lot like him. People of similar moral codes and values, people who would take an arrow for him without thinking twice about it. And now all of a sudden, as we've gone through the transition of the last series, he's surrounded by people who would probably pull him in front of an arrow aimed for them. And so the whole core of this series has been, it's like your friend who finds and falls in with the wrong crowd. And then you got to ask, the question that you want answered when that happens is he going to be able to bring this person or these people up to his level, or are they going to drag him down to theirs? And that's what this whole series has been about. At its core, where I wanted to find that answer, and I didn't know the answer going in for this particular group of people. And the other part of the series is Neverwinter, the setting itself, where I was asked if I was going to be in that area, and since I was, would I be okay with kind of setting the stage for the next computer game that would be set in that area, which basically means blowing the place up. And of course I'm okay with that. That's the fun part of being a writer.
Yeah.
So I blew the place up.
Now, Charons Claw is the name of the third book, and I know it has something to do with a sword, or his sword. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, one of the fun things about fantasy is having powerful weapons or artifacts. And Charons Claw is an ancient Netherese sword. The Netherese are a race of beings who they take great pride in their magical artifacts and swords and weapons of all types. But this came into the hands of one of my hero's enemies or acquaintances. At this point, I don't think I'd call them enemies anymore, or maybe they are. We'll see. Having these types of artifacts in fantasy is always a pleasure, because typically such a powerful sentient weapon can really mess with someone's head. That can just make the plot go all around in circles. So there's a lot of that in there, and what they find out in this book is that it starts out as a revenge quest. There's a really bad guy, and it leads them to understand that there's a really bad thing going on around them that's going to be very hard to stop, and that involves the sword. So there it is.
Okay. Now, is this the last book in the Neverwinter saga, or is there going to be more?
Originally it was, but I already wrote, and I already finished actually the next book, which is coming out next March, called The Last Threshold. And it fits so well with this storyline and really shows the surprising conclusions of the internal battles and the struggle that we decided to include that as well as the fourth book of the saga.
I'm also a writer, but mostly screenplays, and so I'm always curious about the different writers, their approaches to writing. How do you kind of plan out your books? Do you do a kind of a detailed outline? Do you just have a rough idea? How do you usually approach them before you start?
I do an outline. It's not extensive. It's usually 2 to 7 or 8 pages. And then I start writing and I pretty much throw it away. Because the characters take over. The characters start telling me what's coming next. And I find myself a lot of times writing books the same way other people read books, where sometimes I don't even know what's going to happen on the next page. And honestly, that's what makes it fun for me.
Mm-hmm.
And, I let the characters pretty much tell me where we're going.
Cool. I just wanted to ask this question because I read this book, and of course it was kind of shocking in a way. Vector Prime for Star Wars New Jedi Order.
Mm-hmm.
And that's caused a little controversy because, you killed off Chewbacca, and hopefully I didn't spoil anything, but it's been a few years.
Yeah, they got to know by now. Any Star Wars fans don't know that by now. That's their fault.
Yeah. Well, how did that come about, and how do you feel about that turn?
I was working for Del Rey Books at the time, writing my Demon Wars books, and Del Rey got in this huge bidding war with Bantam. Was it Bantam? I think it was Bantam, where Del Rey won the rights to do the Star Wars adult fiction. And this was a really big deal because the rights had been tied up for a lot of years. But this was also right when they were announcing the 3 new movies. Mm. And I was one of Del Rey's authors, and they called me and they needed a book done fast, and they wanted me to be the one to write it. And was I interested? So, Del Rey had treated me really well by bringing me in after I had left TSR in the mid-'90s and the big fallout. And they were really letting me write the Demon Wars series, which I had always wanted to do. I was able to arrange it so that I would find time in my schedule. I had to talk to them, and I was back with Wizards of the Coast at this point, just to make sure they would delay my deadlines to let me do it, and Wizards accommodated me. I said, sure. So they told me the story arc that they were trying to do in the New Jedi Order, just the overall story arc, and I was supposed to, they showed me A to Z, and I was supposed to get them from A to B. So I went out and I wrote up an outline. I accepted the contract. I got the check, the advance check, put it in the bank, wrote up the outline, sent it in, and we were on a 3-way call with Lucasfilm, Del Rey, and myself, and they said, this is really great. This is just what we want, but didn't we tell you have to kill Chewbacca? And I won't tell you what I said next because it was very impolite. But I argued, didn't want to do it. Finally was convinced that they were doing it for the right reasons, and it really did come from on high. I mean, this had gotten the approval at the very highest level, if you can figure out who that is. And so I agreed, and I did it, and the death threats ensued, and the really visceral hatred from some people. It was more than I could have imagined. And how do I feel about it? It's probably the one thing I've done as a writer that I regret. I don't know that they should have done it with that character. But, the Star Wars community is torn over it. Half the people love it, half the people hate it, or some percentage therein. But, when I look back at it, it's like I just don't know that they should have gone there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tough to kill off one of those iconic characters like that. Let's talk about Demon Wars Saga a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
How's that differ from Forgotten Realms and your other books?
Well, the biggest difference is that it's my world. Mm-hmm. So if I want to blow something up, I'll blow it up. If I want to kill off characters, I can kill off characters in the realms too, as long as they're my characters. But in Demon Wars, I'm a little more bloodthirsty. Don't get too attached to anyone. But it's a different... The Demon Wars world is really centers around the Abelican Church and magic gemstones that they control. And the moral center of the world is the church, and it's also the immoral center of the world, and that's the Demon Wars story in defining this world. Details a schism in the church, much like what the Catholic Church went through in our own world, except in our world it was about wealth. You had the Franciscans and the Benedictines, fighting over whether or not they should hoard the money and build these grand cathedrals, or whether they should live as peasants. And Demon Wars, same thing is going on, but with gemstones, where you have half the faction saying that the gemstones are the gifts of God. We're the Word of God, so we are the ones who should have all the gemstones. And these gemstones they're the source of almost all the magic in the world. And then you have another faction that's coming to the conclusion, well, wait a minute, if this one particular mineral or gemstone can heal disease, cure disease, or heal wounds, shouldn't we have it out at every town that we can get it out to, just to help alleviate suffering? Shouldn't we be sharing this kind of power? And that's really the backdrop for the world that is portrayed through an adventure story of 3 characters. And this 7-book series of Demon Wars was designed to create the world with that central conflict in mind. And then after I was done that, my goal was to go back there, which I have, and do more personal stories set in that world. So I went back and I wrote The Highwayman and the Saga of the First King. And The Highwayman just came out on graphic audio, by the way, and graphic audio is amazing. They call it a movie in your mind, and it really is. So if anyone's interested in that and you like audio books, I highly recommend it. But so I go back, I started doing The Highwayman, which takes place hundreds of years before Demon Wars, but shows you a lot of things that are relevant to the world you'll read about when you read The Demon Awakens and the 6 books after that. It's different than the realms in that it's more human-centered than the realms. Humans are one of many races in the realms that are prominent. In Demon Wars, the humans are much more dominant. The cultures are more human-like. Magic is less accessible and more dependent upon the gemstones, which have their own set of rules and how they work and who can access them and how they can access them. And I think it's a little more tougher in terms of, if you like characters, they could get killed. I'm a little more heartless in Demon Wars. I say that, and yet I think that the most compassionate and easily the best book I've ever written in my life is Mortalis, which is the 4th book in the series that bridges the 2 trilogies.
Just out of curiosity, fantasy is getting much bigger now with the Game of Thrones, bigger in TV movies because of Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings.
And Harry Potter.
And Harry Potter, yes. And if they decided to make a Forgotten Realms TV show or movie or something like that, or maybe movie, what story or story arc that you wrote do you think would make a good movie?
In the realms, I'd love to see Homeland, because it would be something so different. The Crystal Shard, all of the Drizzt books are episodic. I think you can pick up almost any of the Drizzt books and start the series with it, which was by design. I mean, I wrote them more along the lines of Sherlock Holmes or James Bond than Wheel of Time or A Song of Ice and Fire. So I think you can really jump in and do just about any of the books. Homeland's still one of my favorites, probably my favorite Drizzt book, and still one of my favorites I've ever done. And bringing that society to the screen, you could have such fun with the lighting that you would use, and it just might be something that people haven't seen before. So I'd like that.
What's the Homeland story about?
That's the origination story for Drizzt. It's where about the Dark Elf City and him being born and growing up in the Dark Elf City.
And the Hobbit's going to have 3 movies now. What do you think about that?
That's my favorite book.
The
Hobbit's my favorite book of all time. It's the book that changed my life. I loved what Peter Jackson did with the first 3 installments.
Do you think they might be going overkill with 3 movies, or you think that'll work?
They might be. I don't know. When I look at the first trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring was my favorite of the 3. It had the charm of Tolkien really burned into it. The beginning scenes in the Shire were just amazing. The way he used light in that opening scene, the forest, he just turned the filter up a little bit. I liked the second one less, and the third one less than that, even though I enjoy them all. and it was because they went more towards CG and battles and blowing things up, which is cool, and you needed that, but I think I got a little too heavy on the CG as the series went along. That's my only criticism. I think Peter Jackson did a magnificent job. Oh, that, and you didn't have Glorfindel in it. You let Arwen have Glorfindel's role, and that bothered me because I love Glorfindel. Mm-hmm. In The Hobbit, I don't know what they're going to do to get 3 movies out of that. If they use 3 movies to tell more of that book, I'm going to love it. If they go into these side stories, like if we get one movie that's all about Tom Bombadil or something, I'm probably not going to like it as much. I think you could get 9 hours or 8.5 hours or 8 hours, whatever it turns out to be, of movie out of The Hobbit. With a logical break at Rivendell and another logical break maybe right before they go into the, right when they first cross the Misty Mountains and come upon Beorn and all of that. So I think you could get 3 movies out of it, and if they do it that way and they're truer to the book, I'm going to love every minute of it.
How long does it take you to write a book?
Depends. I mean, the first Demon Wars book, I spent 6 months building the world before I ever started writing the book, and then I think it took me probably 8 months to write the book. So, that one alone was well over a year. But a Dark Elf book at this point, where, I know the characters very well, then I know who they are, I know their motivations, almost all of them, and I'm only going to introduce a few new ones in each book. I can do one of those in probably 4 to 6 months. Probably 6.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your newest book or anything coming up?
Yeah, the new book comes out August 7th, and again, the next one in the series will be in March. That's called The Last Threshold. And also in October, the 3 books that I wrote with my son Gino, The Stone of Tamora, is coming out in an omnibus, so you can get all 3 in one. And after that, we're rolling along. I'm already well into the next book beyond The Last Threshold.
Oh, wow.
So the road continues.
Are you going to be at Gen Con this year?
I will be at Gen Con and Dragon Con this year.
Are you? I'm going to be at
and Space City Con in Houston, and what's it called, HalCon, or I'll be in Halifax at a convention in October. Plus, I've got a book tour coming up and real soon, and so I'm going to be out on the West Coast, and be down in Texas, going to be back in Kentucky and Ohio, and ending up at Gen Con.
Oh, great. I'll be at Gen Con, so I'll have to stop by and say hi.
Sounds good.
All right, well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Have a good day.
Take care.
Well, thanks to R.A. Salvatore for agreeing to the interview, and his newest book, Charons Claw. Charons Claw hits the bookshelves today.
So that's it for our 8th episode of Genre-tainment.
But before we go, we just wanted to let you know about our web series, Reality on Demand. You can find it at realityondemandseries.com.
So that's it for today, folks, and join us next time on Tuesday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Central. Auf Wiedersehen.
Adios.
Blog Talk Radio, where millions of hosts and listeners gather. Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
Well, I'm Bob Salvatore, R.A. Salvatore, and last month marked a big milestone for me because 25 years ago, last month, July of 1987, I got my first professional writing contract. I had been tasked with writing the second book in TSR's Forgotten Realms, now Wizards of the Coast, but then it was TSR. And so I started writing, and during that I created a character by the name of Drizzt, a dark elf who has caught on, and here I am a quarter century later, still writing about the guy. I've done many other books besides, including a couple of Star Wars books, and my world of Demon Wars, which I love dearly. 11 books in that world and counting. So it's been a heck of a ride. I think I've got about 53 books published now, and many more to come, I hope.
Well, what started you down the path of fantasy writing?
It was a funny thing because Player's Handbook came out in first edition, Dungeon Master's Guide, the first hardcover books, that's when I started playing. But what happened was I had sent my book in, the manuscript for Echoes of the Fourth Magic, and the editor liked it but couldn't publish it because she said they only had room on their schedule for Forgotten Realms books, and could I make that book a Forgotten Realms book? And so I said, well, what are the Forgotten Realms? Because they weren't out yet. So the only people who knew about the realms were the people who worked at TSR. Well, we couldn't set that book in the realms, so they gave me a crash course, and I auditioned and won the audition to do the second book, The Crystal Shard.
Cool. Was it a challenge, and has it been a challenge, writing stories taking place in Forgotten Realms in this shared world? Is it tough to keep track of where everything's at and what's going on?
Oh, it's impossible to keep track, so I don't even try. I keep track of that which is around what I'm doing, and I spend a lot of my time hiding in different, so that all of my electives would be literature courses or creative writing courses. And then, but I had this really warm place in my heart for fantasy because of that Tolkien experience and just the escapism. I loved it so much. So I read every fantasy book I could find, and there weren't that many at that time that you could find. There was no internet in 1977, 78. But I read Terry Brooks and Stephen Donaldson and Anne McCaffrey and Michael Moorcock and Fritz Leiber. I was pretty much out at that point. And so I didn't have anything else to read. I wrote one. I wrote my own book in 1983, 84, around there. And when I finished writing it, this book called Echoes of the Fourth Magic, I wasn't planning on being published. I just sent it out, got some horrible rejection letters, and that just made me mad, so I went back to work and rewrote it. And that book actually got me the audition in 1987 to write The Crystal Shard. I got to college, and I wasn't much of a writer or a reader. When I was younger, I used to read and write all the time, but school kind of beat the interest out of me. And by the time I got to college, I was a math major.
Oh,
well, I was actually undeclared, but everything was math. I was going for math or computer science. And then we had for Christmas, my freshman year in college, this was 1977, my sister gave me a copy of Tolkien's work. 2 months later, we had this incredible snowstorm up here in New England, the blizzard of 78. So here I was, just turned 19 years old, and trapped in my mom's house for a week because there were no roads. You could not leave the house. And, I thought, oh, joy, what am I going to do? And I actually picked up those books and read them, and I went away from that house on this magical journey to Middle-earth with a hobbit named Bilbo. It was incredible. I read those books several times that week, and my love of reading and writing came back. So I went back to school, changed my major.
Wow. Now, you're most famous for your character, how do you pronounce his name, his full name?
It depends what day you ask me. I never really clarify that. Sometimes I say Drizzt, other times I say Drizzt, and the reason is because I think that's like the coolest marketing twist ever. I picture two kids in a high school hallway. It's Drizzt, it's Drizzt, it's Drizzt, it's Drizzt. Third kid comes over and says, "What the hell are you talking about?" And they go, "You never read these?" And I win. So we'll call him Drizzt for this one.
Very clever, yeah. Well, now that character takes place in the campaign setting of Forgotten Realms from the Dungeons & Dragons games. Were you familiar with Forgotten Realms before you wrote that character? Did you used to play Forgotten Realms before you wrote that character?
No, I was familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, very much so, because this was, like I said, 1987, and I had started playing D&D in 1980, 81, around there, when the first edition